The wind swept across the barren plains of the new frontier world, carrying fine dust that stung the skin and made the air shimmer in strange golden waves. Talai moved with careful deliberation, her hands steady as she examined the rough metallic surface that would become the foundation of her home. To any outsider, it might have seemed an odd way to spend the first day on a planet so unforgiving. Talai species, unlike humans, were used to living in large shared habitats. They found comfort in communal life and the constant presence of others. Yet Talai had chosen solitude. She had chosen to build slowly, deliberately, to create a place that was entirely hers. It was an act of patience, a rebellion against the rush and efficiency her people prized. The wind tugged at the cloth of her protective garment as she set the first structural beams into place. Each beam was fitted with precision, locked into grooves that she had measured herself. There were no drones or automated machines here, no rapid construction units like those the human settlements used. Everything was her own work, slow but exact. Talai did not mind. In this deliberate rhythm, she found a quiet joy. The world was harsh, but in her labor, she could shape a small corner of it to her liking. Far across the plains, the human settlement glinted like a cluster of distant stars. Jonah Reed watched from his habitation module, his hands pressed against the window as he traced the lines of the empty rooms inside. The walls were functional, sterile, efficient, but to him they felt hollow. Each room echoed with memories that were not his, spaces meant for a family he would never have. The death of his wife and unborn child had left a hole inside him, one that no technological convenience could fill. He had come to this frontier world seeking work, a distraction, a chance to survive. Yet every corner of the settlement reminded him of what he had lost. Jonah noticed Talai first when the dust storm rose that evening, the horizon turning a deep, fiery orange. A lone figure moved against the wind, erecting strange structures that seemed both foreign and mesmerizing. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. He watched, fascinated, as she carried heavy beams across the plain, with nothing but her strength and focus. He had seen humans do such work, of course, but never with such deliberate patience, never without machines or team assistance. There was something profoundly human in her dedication, though he did not know her species. He did not understand why he felt a strange kinship from such a distance, but it tugged at him. Talai worked as if she did not notice the storm, as if the wind and dust were companions rather than adversaries. She paused occasionally to adjust a beam, to examine the alignment, to ensure that everything fit perfectly. Her home would be more than shelter. It would be a testament to careful thought and resilience. Her species could construct vast cities in days, using complex algorithms and communal labor, but she refused to rely on any of it. She wanted to experience every inch of her creation, to imprint herself on every surface. It was an act of defiance, yes, but also an act of identity. The storm approached faster than she had expected. Dust swirled around her feet, forming miniature whirlwinds that tugged at her clothing and obscured her vision. She paused, shielding her eyes, and scanned the horizon. That was when she saw a human figure approaching from the settlement, moving erratically against the wind. At first, she thought he might be lost or careless, but as he drew closer, she saw the telltale signs of exhaustion. He stumbled, nearly falling in the shifting dust. Talai considered ignoring him. It would be simpler, safer, but something in the human's eyes caught her attention. A look of determination laced with desperation. Something she recognized despite the difference in species. Jonah staggered to the edge of her partially built structure, coughing and wiping dust from his eyes. He looked around, seeking shelter, and froze when he realized someone was already there. Talai stood silently, watching him. Neither spoke at first. The wind roared between them, carrying grit and sound in chaotic patterns. Finally, Talai gestured toward the partially enclosed structure, indicating that he could take refuge. Jonah hesitated, then moved quickly, grateful for the protection. The space inside was narrow but sturdy, and the walls blocked most of the wind. He lowered himself to the ground, coughing, while Tale returned to her work, adjusting beams with calm precision. Jonah watched her, a mixture of awe and curiosity stirring inside him. He had spent years studying human engineering, yet this alien figure was building something that felt alive, something that seemed to grow from intention rather than necessity.
You're alone? Jonah asked, finally finding his voice.
His words were tentative, unsure. Talal paused, considering him. In her language, there was no exact translation for the word alone, as humans understood it. Solitude was a choice, not a state to lament. She shook her head slightly and spoke in careful, deliberate, common, the language humans use for interspecies communication. I am building, Jonah frowned, trying to understand. Yes, I see that. But why here? Why alone? Tale glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the storm-filtered sky. I build slowly. I choose. Jonah nodded, though he did not fully understand. He had spent so long trying to find meaning in his work, in efficiency, in rules and schedules. Here was someone who worked for herself, for no one else, against no deadlines, against no expectations. There was a strange bravery in that. The storm raged outside, but inside the partially constructed structure, a fragile silence settled. Jonah noticed the subtle details of Tale's work. The careful alignment of beams, the precise notches, the small panels she had already placed to block the wind. Each decision had been made with thought, not speed. There was patience in her movements. Patience he had almost forgotten existed. Your home, it's very different from mine, Jonah said, finally breaking the silence. Mine is built for efficiency, for survival. Yours, it feels alive. Talai considered this. Her species did not often dwell on concepts like life or aliveness outside communal patterns, yet she felt the truth of his words. In her own quiet way, she was creating something more than shelter. She was creating a place that mattered. It is mine, she said simply. Jonah smiled faintly, a small, fragile thing. I used to think a home was just walls and a roof. Now, I'm not so sure. For hours, the two sat in the narrow shelter, listening to the storm batter the landscape. Outside, the dust swirled like a miniature galaxy, yet inside, there was warmth. Not from heat, but from presence. Talai continued to adjust beams and panels, while Jonah watched, learning without understanding, appreciating without judgment. As the storm subsided, Jonah stepped outside briefly to survey the horizon. He noticed other humans in the distance, tending to their automated modules, moving quickly, efficiently. They would never see the beauty in what Tale had begun. They would never understand the courage it took to move deliberately, to choose solitude in a world that prized conformity and speed. He turned back to Talaway, who was fitting a final panel for the night. The last rays of the sun filtered through the dust, casting long shadows across her work. Jonah realized that, for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about loss. He was thinking about possibility, about the strange, quiet bravery of someone who dared to shape the world slowly, carefully, on their own terms. Tale glanced at him, catching the subtle shift in his expression. She did not fully understand humans, and she did not need to. Yet she sensed that this fragile, determined creature might understand something about her that her own species never could. Perhaps he would stay, she thought, though she did not speak it aloud. Perhaps he could share in the quiet labor of building something meaningful. Night fell over the plains, and the stars appeared, sharp and bright in the thin atmosphere. Talai worked by the faint glow of her panels and the light of distant stars, while Jonah watched, captivated by the simplicity and determination in her movements. They did not speak, yet a subtle connection formed, woven from shared presence and the unspoken recognition of courage, patience, and solitude. By the time the second day arrived, Talay's home had taken form. Still incomplete, still imperfect, but unmistakably alive. Jonah remained nearby, tending to his own settlement, yet drawn back repeatedly to the partially built structure. The wind still howled, the dust still swirled, but inside the shelter there was something more enduring than any storm. A quiet act of creation, deliberate and unhurried, and a fragile understanding that even in solitude, life could touch another. Talay continued to build, slowly, one careful step at a time. Jonah continued to watch, quietly learning the rhythms of patience and the courage it took to choose one's own path. Each beam Talay placed, each panel she adjusted, told a story of determination, of individuality, and of quiet, unspoken hope. It was not a story of conquest or heroism, not yet, but it was the story of life itself. Fragile, deliberate, and utterly human in its resonance, even when shaped by alien hands. And as the first true night fell, the two figures looked at the horizon in silence. For Talay, it was the satisfaction of building something solely her own. For Jonah, it was the first stirrings of hope that life in all its forms could be rebuilt, slowly, carefully, and with courage enough to endure. The next morning, the horizon was painted with pale gold, and the wind had softened to a steady, persistent hum across the plains. Talay was already at work, inspecting the panels she had fitted the night before. Each one had been carefully aligned, yet the storm had shifted a few, and she adjusted them with meticulous precision. For Talay, every mistake was an opportunity to improve, every imperfection a lesson learned. Jonah approached cautiously, aware that he was entering territory he did not fully understand. She had not spoken much, yet he felt a strange sense of welcome, as if by simply being present he was part of the slow rhythm of her world. He carried a small toolbox with him, though it was mostly for show. He did not know what tools her species preferred, or how they might work with their materials, but he wanted to help in some way, to contribute, however clumsy he might feel. "You have a system," Jonah said, breaking the silence.
Every piece in its place, it's
Precise. Talay glanced at him. Precision, to her, was natural. Yet, humans seemed to equate it with obsession or control. She tilted her head slightly. Everything matters. Every piece fits, slowly, carefully. It is the way I choose. Jonah nodded. He had worked with engineers and architects all his life, but there was a difference between calculated efficiency and deliberate creation. He could feel it in the air around her structure, a quiet energy that radiated from careful thought and patience. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced in his own settlements, where speed and productivity were always the measures of success.
I've never seen anyone build like this,
Jonah admitted. Even humans, when they come to this planet, they want everything done quickly. Prefab units, drones, automated tools. They call it progress. But this, he waved his hand toward the growing structure.
This feels alive.
Talay considered this.
Humans often spoke of life and emotion in ways that were foreign to her.
Her species measured life in cycles, in communal survival, not in the fragility of individual choices. Yet she understood what he meant. There was a rhythm here, a pulse of intention that made the structure more than its materials. It was, in its own way, alive. Jonah sat on a nearby rock, watching as she worked. He was not needed. She clearly preferred to work alone. Yet he could not resist being near her. He found himself thinking about the stories his wife had loved, tales of people building lives and homes against impossible odds. He had never imagined that those stories could have relevance here, on a barren, hostile world, with an alien building next to him. "Do you miss them?" Talay asked suddenly, without turning. Her voice was soft, careful, almost hesitant. Jonah flinched. He had been trying not to think about Earth, about the family he had lost, about the empty rooms he carried inside him. Yet her question touched something he could not ignore. "Yes," he said finally. "Every day. But I think about trying again too. About building something new. Maybe not like I imagined, not like I wanted, but something." Tale paused her work, considering the human's words. Humans seemed to carry loss differently than her species. They did not simply move on. They carried it, layer upon layer, yet still dared to dream. There was courage in that, a form of bravery she had rarely seen. "I do not know this dreaming," she said slowly. "We do not hope in the same way. We do not lose and rebuild alone. It is strange to me." Jonah smiled faintly. "It is strange, and yet, somehow, it works. Somehow humans keep going, even when everything seems impossible." The day stretched long and quiet. Talai moved from beam to panel, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Jonah followed in his own way, tidying nearby materials, adjusting stakes and supports, though always careful not to interfere with her method. They worked in parallel, two species united by purpose, yet separated by understanding. As the sun climbed higher, a communication signal blinked from Jonah's habitation module. He glanced at it, hesitated, then shook his head. The council had sent inspectors to review all new settlements on the frontier planet. Efficiency and safety were their measures of worth, and any deviation could result in fines, penalties, or even forced relocation. Talai's slow, deliberate construction would be seen as inefficient, unconventional, and perhaps unacceptable. Jonah sighed, the weight of bureaucracy pressing against him like the thin air of the high plains. He had survived loss, storms, and isolation, but paperwork and inspectors had a way of feeling like chains. He did not want to leave Talai's side, yet he knew that once the council arrived, things might change. He said nothing, continuing to observe her work until she noticed his expression. "You are troubled," she said. "Why?" Jonah shook his head. "It is nothing, only rules. Humans make them, and sometimes they make life more difficult than it needs to be." Tale tilted her head. "Rules, humans follow them even when they make no sense?" Jonah smiled wryly. "Often, but sometimes we break them when it matters. Sometimes survival isn't about rules. It's about doing what is right." Tale considered this. Her species had rules too, but breaking them carried consequences not just for the individual, but for the community. Humans were strange in their willingness to risk everything for a personal choice, for a moral decision, or even for hope. She found it fascinating and a little terrifying. By mid-afternoon, the sound of distant engines approached. Jonah looked toward the horizon and saw the inspector's transport craft descending, sleek and cold against the soft landscape. Their drones hovered like silent eyes, scanning the terrain. Talai paused her work, examining the approaching visitors. Her instinct was to continue building, ignoring their presence, but Jonah's hand on her shoulder stopped her, gentle but firm. "They will not understand," he said quietly. "You need to speak, not for them, for yourself." Tale nodded slowly, gathering her courage. She had spent her life following her own path, often in defiance of her people's expectations. But the humans operated differently. They listened when spoken to, even if they did not understand immediately. Perhaps this was an opportunity to assert her choice, to defend the slow labor that had become part of her identity. The inspectors landed, stepping out with measured precision. They were human, but their expressions were clinical, almost mechanical. They observed Tale's structure, their scanners sweeping over beams and panels with impersonal efficiency. Talai felt a surge of unease. She had built this home for herself, for the quiet joy of creation, not for approval. Yet she realized that the moment of judgment had arrived. Jonah stepped forward, standing beside her. "This is her work," he said firmly. "It is deliberate, thoughtful, and strong. It may not meet your standards of efficiency, but it meets every requirement for safety. And more than that, it has heart. It has life."
The lead inspector raised an eyebrow. Heart?
Life. Those are not measurable qualities. Jonah met his gaze. Perhaps they should be. Sometimes survival isn't just about numbers and regulations. Sometimes it's about intent, courage, and patience. She built this, slowly. Yes, but it stands, and it will endure because of the care put into it. Tale watched him, struck by the sincerity in his voice. Humans spoke in ways that her species rarely did, with emotion, with argument rooted not in communal consensus, but in individual conviction. She had never thought of her work being defended, yet here was a human standing for it, and in doing so, acknowledging her right to create on her own terms. The inspectors exchanged glances, murmuring quietly. Their scanners continued to sweep, noting measurements, angles, and tolerances. Jonah remained calm, unwavering. He had survived storms, isolation, and loss. He could survive a panel of human inspectors questioning the value of deliberate work. After what seemed an eternity, the lead inspector finally spoke. "The structure is unconventional, but it is sound. The decision to allow continued construction will be left to local authorities. Any further deviations from approved standards must be documented." Jonah nodded, suppressing a sigh of relief. Understood. The inspectors departed, their craft lifting and disappearing into the pale sky. Talai exhaled, tension leaving her body slowly. She had expected resistance, perhaps confrontation, but none had come beyond the mechanical review. And through it all, Jonah had stood with her, a human affirming the right to choose, to build, and to endure. As the wind settled once more, Talay resumed her work, moving with renewed focus. Jonah assisted quietly, fetching tools, stabilizing beams, adjusting stakes. They worked together in silence, the rhythm of their labor creating a quiet harmony. There was no need for conversation. Each understood the other in subtle, unspoken ways. Evening arrived, and the sky deepened into shades of violet and orange. The plains were quiet again, except for the faint hum of wind through the unfinished structure. Tale placed the final panel of the day, stepping back to examine her work. The lines were clean, the foundation solid, and for the first time, she felt a sense of completion, however temporary. Jonah sat nearby, watching the light fade. "It's remarkable," he said softly. "You've made something, enduring. Even the storms cannot break it." Tale looked at him, and for the first time, she felt the possibility of connection, of shared purpose. "It is mine," she said. "But it is better with company." Jonah smiled faintly, feeling a warmth he had not known for years. Perhaps it was hope. Perhaps it was something more fragile, something delicate and precious. He did not know. But for the first time, he imagined a life beyond loss, a life in which the act of creation could be shared, slowly, deliberately, with someone who understood the courage it took to build against time, against expectation, and against solitude. The night settled over the plains, stars emerging one by one in the clear, thin air. Talai and Jonah worked quietly, side by side, a human and an alien, each learning from the other. She learned patience not just in construction, but in trust. He learned courage, not just in survival, but in hope. The frontier world stretched endlessly around them, harsh and indifferent. Yet inside their fragile corner of it, there was warmth, there was life, and there was the promise that slow, deliberate effort and the choice to endure could bridge species, worlds, and hearts. And as they finally rested, the wind whispering through half-finished panels, both felt the unspoken truth. Life, in all its forms, could be rebuilt. Slowly, carefully, and together. The morning air carried a heavy tension. The winds were calm, almost too calm, and the horizon shimmered with an uneasy heat haze. Tale had just finished adjusting a section of her walls when the first tremors hit the ground. At first, they were subtle. Small vibrations under her feet, the kind that might have been dismissed as minor shifts in the soil. But then the tremors grew stronger, shaking the loose dust into swirling clouds and causing her carefully placed panels to rattle. She braced herself against a beam, sensing the danger immediately. Jonah, who had been surveying the distant human modules, felt it first through the soles of his boots. The ground moved beneath him like a living thing, unpredictable and angry. His heart raced as he ran toward Tale's structure, shouting her name over the sudden roar of shifting dust and sliding rocks. The humans were not alone here. Their machines screamed in protest, alarms blaring from automated systems struggling to maintain balance. Tale steadied herself, gripping the beams with her strength and training. She had anticipated the possibility of seismic events, even if rare, when choosing the location and design of her home. Every panel had been overbuilt, every joint reinforced. She had considered, for hours and days, the failures that could come, and had built against them. But she had not anticipated the human reaction. Jonah reached her side, stumbling over displaced earth.
Tale, is everything...
"Stable!" he yelled, trying to see through the swirling dust. "It will hold," she said, voice steady even as a larger tremor shook the structure.
But the humans in the settlement, they are not prepared. Jonah followed her gaze toward the distant modules.
Automated supports buckled under the shifting ground. Walls that were supposed to resist even the harsh winds of the planet began to tilt and sway dangerously. It was a disaster in slow motion, machines and rigid structures collapsing because they were designed for order, not improvisation. "Come on," Jonah said. "We have to help them." Tale nodded. She understood his instinct. Humans, unlike her species, thrived in crisis not by following preset rules, but by adapting. And Jonah's species had a strange brilliance in improvisation. She had watched him and his kind before, seen them survive against odds that would crush others. She followed him, moving with speed and precision. The first settlement module was a twisted mass of metal and flashing lights. Jonah scanned quickly, assessing weak points and escape routes. Automated drones whirred ineffectively, bumping into walls trapped by their programmed routines. Jonah shouted commands, redirecting drones, stabilizing temporary supports, and manually adjusting panels. His hands moved fast but careful, each motion precise yet flexible, a human solution to an unpredictable problem. Tale worked alongside him, moving beams and supports into position where human machinery could not reach. Her strength, honed through years of deliberate labor, allowed her to lift panels that would have required a team of humans. She placed them carefully, almost like solving a puzzle, each panel supporting another. The two of them moved as one, an unusual partnership forged in crisis, bridging species and habits. As the tremors intensified, smaller structures around the settlement began to collapse. Dust and debris filled the air, making breathing difficult. Jonah shouted directions to scattered colonists, many of whom had panicked, frozen in indecision. "Form lines! Move to open spaces! Use portable shields!" His voice carried over the chaos, commanding attention through clarity and urgency. His ability to improvise, to combine his knowledge of human systems with quick thinking, saved lives even as the ground itself threatened to swallow them. Tale moved silently, yet every action had weight. She reinforced weak walls, adjusted heavy panels, and helped guide colonists to safety. She noticed the humans' fear, their uncertainty, and felt a strange empathy. Her species rarely experienced individual panic. Fear was a shared communal experience. But here, with these humans, fear was personal, yet they acted anyway. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring. Hours passed in a blur of dust, noise, and relentless motion. The tremors slowed but did not stop, each aftershock testing the limits of improvised structures. Jonah coordinated rescue efforts, balancing calculated risk with immediate necessity. He climbed to the top of a partially collapsed wall, stabilizing a section just as it threatened to fall entirely. Talay followed his lead, placing her weight carefully, adjusting supports with precise timing. Together, they created a temporary but functional network of protection. At one point, Jonah found himself trapped under a shifting panel. He grunted, struggling to lift it, but the weight was too much. Talay rushed forward, bracing against the ground and lifting the panel with controlled strength. Jonah pulled himself free, panting, and looked at her with gratitude. "I didn't expect anyone to be this strong," he admitted. "I planned for failure," she said simply. Strength alone is not enough. Preparation matters. Jonah smiled faintly, wiping dust from his brow. "You are remarkable. Not just strong, but clever. You think ahead in ways humans often forget." The tremors gradually subsided as the day wore on, leaving behind a landscape marked by upheaval but not total destruction. Many of the human structures had failed completely, but thanks to Jonah's ingenuity and Talay's foresight, lives had been saved. The colonists, exhausted and shaken, looked at the partially built alien home, realizing it had withstood what their systems could not. Jonah surveyed the scene. He had lost track of the hours, his body aching from constant movement, his mind exhausted from rapid decision-making. Yet he felt a surge of pride. Humans, he thought, survive not because of technology alone, but because of creativity, courage, and willingness to act when everything seems impossible. And Talay, she was living proof that deliberate preparation could save as many lives as quick action. Talay, for her part, did not celebrate. Her species did not celebrate success in isolation, and yet she felt satisfaction in the endurance of her creation. She had built slowly, deliberately, and now that patience had paid off in a tangible, undeniable way. The humans might not understand the depth of her planning, but they could feel the results. The walls had held. The panels had supported. The lives had survived. As evening fell, Jonah and Talay sat among the scattered survivors, listening to the quiet hum of recovering machinery and the distant cries of relief. The sky was deep violet, stars beginning to pierce the dusk. For the first time, Jonah allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the trauma of loss. He looked at Talay, who was methodically checking her panels one last time for the day, and felt a strange sense of hope. "You think too far ahead," he said gently, breaking the quiet. "I admire that, even if it makes me feel a little lazy in comparison." Talay glanced at him, tilting her head. "Thinking ahead is survival. You humans act in the moment, but sometimes you do not plan for tomorrow. But you survive, yes, but you risk unnecessary loss." Jonah smiled faintly. "And yet, you need humans, too. We act when things fall apart. We improvise. We make mistakes and fix them quickly. You couldn't have saved all these people alone." She considered this. Humans were unpredictable, often reckless, yet they had resilience she could not deny. Her species measured life in certainty and control. Humans measured it in risk and response. And somehow, against the chaos, their methods complemented each other. Night came fully, dark and cool, and the survivors began to settle into temporary shelters. Talay's home, though incomplete, became a haven for those displaced by the quake. Her panels, carefully designed, held strong against the night wind, and the structure became a symbol of deliberate resilience. Humans moved inside, grateful for the safety it provided. Jonah watched as colonists praised her design, realizing that her patience and care had created not just a shelter, but a lifeline. Jonah approached Talay, standing silently as she adjusted a support beam. "You've built something extraordinary," he said. Not just a home, but a safe place. A place to survive when everything else fails. Talay nodded, though she did not speak immediately. She had built homes before, but never with such significance. Her species rarely built in isolation, and rarely did their structures save lives in ways that require both patience and cooperation. She had thought of her home as a personal project, an act of self-definition. Now she saw that it had become something more. A bridge between species, a testament to the value of deliberate, thoughtful action. Jonah sat on a nearby panel, exhausted but alert. "Humans learn quickly in crisis," he said. "We fail, we adapt, we survive. But we need guidance too."
Your work, it gave structure to our survival.
Talay tilted her head. "And you gave courage."
"Your species acts when the moment demands. Alone, you may falter. Together, you endure. We are different, yet the same." Jonah considered her words, feeling the weight and truth behind them. Humans and Talay's species were not identical, but the principles of endurance, creativity, and courage were universal. They had just witnessed it in action, in the survival of a settlement, in the preservation of lives, and in the quiet, deliberate labor of a home built slowly and intentionally. As they watched the horizon darken, a quiet understanding passed between them. Talay's work and Jonah's action had created more than a home. They had created trust, respect, and a fragile but real connection. The frontier world remained harsh, unpredictable, and dangerous. But within this small corner, a lesson had been demonstrated. Deliberate preparation and human ingenuity, working together, could withstand even nature's harshest tests. The night deepened, and Jonah and Talay finally allowed themselves a moment of rest. Around them, survivors huddled, machinery hummed cautiously, and stars shone brightly in the thin air. Talay reflected on the day's events, recognizing that her patience had been tested in ways she had not imagined. Jonah reflected on the human's resilience and the value of deliberate work, seeing the combination as something greater than either could achieve alone. And as the wind whispered across the plains, both felt a quiet certainty. The frontier was unforgiving, and life here demanded courage, ingenuity, and careful thought. They had endured the storm together, not as species apart, but as collaborators, as individuals learning from each other, as builders of a world that could survive because they dared to try. The first hints of dawn began to brush the horizon, painting the sky in muted golds and pinks. Talay looked at her home, battered yet intact, and for the first time allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Jonah joined her, tired but unbroken, and together they watched the frontier awaken. In the quiet that followed disaster, a new understanding had taken root. Talay's slow, deliberate building had saved lives, and Jonah's improvisation had guided them through chaos. Together, they had shown that survival was not just a matter of species or machinery, but of courage, ingenuity, and the willingness to endure against impossible odds. And as the morning light touched the plains, they began again. Not in haste, not in fear, but with careful purpose and shared resolve. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the horizon glowing with pale amber light. The frontier world's winds were calm, leaving the scarred plains of the previous day exposed. Jonah stood outside Talay's home, surveying the scene with a mix of exhaustion and quiet satisfaction. The tremors had ceased, the settlements had stabilized, and life, fragile and stubborn, had endured. Yet he knew this was only temporary. The Planetary Council would arrive soon, and with them, judgment and scrutiny. Talay moved alongside him, adjusting a panel that had shifted slightly in the aftershocks. Her hands worked with precision, and her gaze was focused, but there was a subtle warmth in her expression. The storm and the quake had tested her, yet her deliberate labor had proven its worth. Her home, built slowly and intentionally, had survived where more automated structures had failed. It was a testament not only to her strength, but to foresight, and patience. Jonah glanced at her, noticing the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes. "You did more than build a home," he said quietly. "You built a safe place, a foundation for people to survive. That's remarkable." Tale considered his words. She rarely received praise, for her species valued function over recognition. Yet she felt a faint satisfaction, the quiet acknowledgement that her efforts mattered. "It is necessary," she replied simply. "Preparation matters more than speed."
In the distance, a transport craft approached, sleek and precise against the pale sky.
The Planetary Council had come, their presence formal and imposing. Their drones hovered over the settlement, scanning the area with analytical efficiency. Jonah tightened his grip on a support beam and stepped closer to Tale. "They will judge," he said.
They may not understand what we've done here.
Tale's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then they must see it. The result, not the method. The result matters." The council representatives disembarked, their uniforms crisp, their expressions detached. They were all human. Officials trained to evaluate settlements by standardized metrics of efficiency, safety, and resource use. Yet even in their composed demeanor, there was curiosity. This frontier world had seen few disasters, and the survival of the settlement against recent seismic events had caught their attention. Jonah met them halfway, standing beside Tale. "This is her work," he said firmly. "Her home, her design. It survived what our modules could not. It saved lives. Efficiency alone could not do this. Care, patience, and preparation did." The lead inspector stepped forward, scanning the structure, with a device that measured stress, alignment, and material integrity. "Unconventional design," the inspector said. "Redundant supports, non-standard panels, overbuilt structures. It meets safety criteria, but it deviates from approved specifications." Jonah nodded. "Yes, it deviates. But deviation does not mean failure. It means thinking ahead. It means surviving when the unexpected occurs."
The inspectors exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves.
Tale stood silently, her posture calm yet firm. She had anticipated scrutiny, but she was unafraid. Her work spoke for itself. Each beam, each panel, each careful adjustment was evidence of intention and skill. A junior council member approached, holding a tablet. "Colonists report that this structure provided critical shelter during the quake. Your design saved lives." Tale inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement.
"It is my purpose," she said, "to endure."
To protect, to build deliberately. The inspectors paused, their expression betraying a hint of surprise. They had expected efficiency reports, material calculations, and procedural compliance. They had not expected this. A structure that combined deliberate planning, resilience, and adaptive foresight. The human methods had faltered under stress, but the deliberate work of an alien mind had provided stability. Jonah stepped forward. Humans survive through adaptation, through ingenuity, through courage under pressure. But even we need guidance, structures built with care, with thought, with attention to detail. They matter. They endure. They save lives. The lead inspector nodded slowly, reassessing their initial assumptions. This design, it demonstrates value beyond standard metrics. While unconventional, it fulfills the purpose of habitation and safety. Documentation of deviations will be required, but continued construction may proceed. Talai allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The council had acknowledged the worth of deliberate labor, of thoughtful planning, even if it did not conform to familiar standards. She had defended her work, and it had been recognized. Jonah exhaled, relief washing over him. "You see," he said quietly, turning to her, "even in a system that values rules, there is space for what truly matters." Talai considered his words, feeling a faint connection to this species that operated so differently from her own. Humans embraced risk and improvisation, yet their courage and ingenuity allowed them to survive in ways her species rarely practiced. She had always known patience and care were valuable, but seeing them combined with human adaptability created something extraordinary. The council representatives departed, leaving behind a settlement that was intact, if slightly battered, and a home that had proven its worth. Jonah and Tale stood together, surveying the scene. Colonists were repairing their modules, guided by Jonah's instructions and inspired by Tale's design. There was a quiet energy in the air, a sense that life could continue, that survival was not just possible, but probable when courage and deliberate effort combined. Jonah turned to Talaway. "You've taught me something," he said softly. "Even in disaster, even when everything seems against us, careful thought and patience mattered just as much as quick action." Tale inclined her head. "And you have shown me courage under pressure. Human action, improvisation. It has value I did not fully understand." Different, yet together we endure. The day passed quietly. Tale returned to her home, making adjustments, reinforcing panels, and preparing for the next stage of construction. Jonah assisted, moving beams, adjusting stakes, and helping guide colonists. They worked in rhythm, the slow, deliberate labor of Tale complemented by Jonah's human ingenuity. Together they created a space that was stronger, more resilient, and more alive than either could achieve alone. Evening came, casting long shadows across the plains. The stars began to pierce the twilight, sharp and clear in the thin atmosphere. Jonah and Tale paused, surveying the settlement and her home. The frontier world remained harsh and unpredictable. But within this small corner, a sense of stability had taken root. "You think too far ahead," Jonah said, a faint smile crossing his face. "I admire that, and yet I sometimes wonder if humans can learn to build like this, slowly, deliberately, with thought for tomorrow as well as today." Tale considered him. "Perhaps you are learning, and perhaps my people would benefit from your courage and adaptability." Jonah laughed softly. "Maybe, but it is enough that we learn from each other here. Together, we can endure more than either species alone." They returned to the partially built structure, placing panels, adjusting supports, and preparing for the coming days. Tale's home was no longer merely her personal project. It had become a symbol of cooperation, endurance, and the value of deliberate effort combined with human ingenuity. The colonists recognized it as a haven, a place of safety, and a model for rebuilding. Over the next few weeks, the settlement slowly recovered. Human modules were repaired or rebuilt, often incorporating lessons from Tale's design. Jonah continued to guide the efforts, combining human creativity with the deliberate foresight he had observed in Tale's work. Tale continued to expand her home slowly and intentionally, reinforcing panels, adding new sections, and creating spaces for others to use if needed. Through these shared efforts, the bond between Tale and Jonah deepened. They spoke more freely, sharing insights, stories, and observations. Tale learned more about human emotions, about hope, grief, and resilience. Jonah learned more about deliberate planning, foresight, and patience. Together, they discovered that the combination of these qualities created something extraordinary: the ability to endure against the harshest conditions and to thrive in a world that had tested them. One evening, as the sun set behind distant mountains, casting long shadows across the plains, Jonah and Tale stood on the highest point of the partially built home. They surveyed the settlement below, the colonists working quietly but purposefully. For the first time since arriving on this frontier world, Jonah allowed himself to imagine a life beyond loss. He saw the potential for growth, for shared effort, for hope. Tale glanced at him, her expression calm but thoughtful. You think about the future differently than your species usually does, she said.
You consider possibility, even after loss.
It is remarkable. Jonah smiled faintly. Humans endure. We adapt. We dream again, even when it seems impossible. And perhaps we can teach others to do the same. Tale nodded, understanding more deeply than before. The frontier world was harsh, yet it had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate the value of deliberate effort, human ingenuity, and cooperation across species. She had built her home slowly, carefully, and now it was a beacon of survival, resilience, and hope. Night fell fully, and the stars filled the sky. The settlement was quiet, the colonists resting after weeks of hard labor. Jonah and Tale remained on the highest point of the home, side by side, reflecting on all that had occurred. Baby Feast Day. Baby 4 days event. The frontier world remained challenging, but they had endured. They had survived storms, tremors, and the skepticism of the council. They had done so together, combining human courage with deliberate foresight. And as they looked to the horizon, both felt a quiet certainty. The frontier was vast, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous, but with courage, ingenuity, patience, and cooperation, life could thrive. The story of survival was not just theirs. It was the story of humans, of aliens, and of the fragile, enduring beauty of deliberate creation. Tale's home was no longer just her own. It was a testament to patience, resilience, and the quiet power of building slowly, with purpose, and with heart. Jonah's presence had shown her that even in solitude, connections could form, and even in disaster, hope could endure. Together, they had demonstrated the enduring strength of life, fragile, courageous, and profoundly human. The wind whispered through the panels, carrying dust, light, and the faint promise of future growth. The frontier world was still vast, still challenging, yet within this small corner, life had found a way. And Tale and Jonah, human and alien, builder and survivor, stood together, ready to face whatever came next, slowly, deliberately, and with courage enough to endure.